So welcome back. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 7, and we're going to go over what's known as lists and tuples. Today we're going to talk about sequences and what a sequence is, which gives us our introduction to list. With that, we'll talk about list slicing, and we'll find items in the list with the in operator. We also will go ahead and talk about some methods and functions that are useful and built into the list. Then we're going to talk about how we can copy and process lists. We're going to talk about list comprehensions, two-dimensional lists, and then we're going to wrap up the chapter with tuples. So let's dive in. Let me introduce you to what's known as a sequence. A sequence is an object that contains multiple items of data. And these items are stored in sequential order. That's why we get the term sequence. So one of our more popular sequences is Python's list. We also will cover tuples later in the class. So the difference between the list and the tuples is that a list is mutable and a tuple is immutable. I know, right away you're already saying, Professor Waits, what is mutable? What's immutable? Not a problem. With mutable, you can change it. With immutable, you cannot change after the creation. So when you create this object, this immutable object, it's then solid and it's solidified. You can't change it. So that brings us right into our first sequence, which is known as a list. Now, you've already probably used a list already. You just didn't know you were using a list. So let's talk about that. The way we do a list is we have a variable, and then we have the items contained in that variable. Now, the important thing to know is that the items have to be surrounded by these brackets. Also, our list can hold items that are of different types. So you might see a list that has nothing but numbers, and some may have nothing but strings, but you can mix those items in the same list as well. When we use the print function on a list, it's going to print the entire list. And then finally, with the list function, we can convert certain types of objects to a list. So, at the top here, we can see that we have a list of just integers. Then we have a list of just strings. And then finally, this list contains both integers, floats, and strings. Now, the repetition operator makes where we can take multiple copies of a list and join them together. So remember, this is going to make these multiple copies and then join them together. This is great if you're making a sequence that you want something very specific repeated over and over again, but a certain number of them. And that is list using the star operator, and then n as in the number of times you want to have this duplicated. We can also talk real quick about how to iterate over a list using a for loop. And again, we've already used this. This command here, this operator, this in, is how we go ahead and iterate. Additionally, this is our list, and as we iterate, each time we iterate, the item that we're on will be placed in our variable that we have named here. Now let's talk about indexing. When we have a list, we need to be able to get to elements within the list. And to do that, we're going to use an index. So index is a number specifying the position of an element in a list. One of the more important things to remember is that Python uses an indexing of 0 as its first item. So the first item in your list will be at index 0, not at index 1. In fact, index 1 will be the second item. If we want to go backwards, let's say we want to start at the end and go to the left, we can use negative indexes to do that. So the negative index of -1 indicates the last element, while -2 indicates the next to last element. One of the most popular things that we need to do with a list is to find out how big the list is. So we use the length function. And this will return us a number that will tell us the size of our list. Now, remember that when we do this, we want to make sure if we're using it as an index that we have to always say -1. And that's because we are 0 indexed. As in, if the length of our item, our list, is 1, that means the very first and only item is at index of 0. That's why we say length list -1. And then real quick, just so we make sure we cover it, we don't really talk about exceptions, but sometimes exceptions will still happen to us. And if we see that we get an index error, that exception occurs when we've tried to get to an element that does not exist within our list. For example, our list that we were just talking about, that's the size of 1. If we were to try to say index of 1, we would get an index error because, remember, we only have an index of 0. Index of 1 would be a second item, which this list doesn't have. So that's why we get index error. So we already talked about this, but let's talk about it a little bit more. Lists are mutable. And again, as we know, that means that the items in the sequence can be changed. We can change this item. It's known as a mutable list. To do this, we're simply going to go ahead and say our item with our index is this new value. And remember, we're using the equal sign, which is the assign operator, not the double equal sign, which is the equation to compare two items. So single equals assigns this value over to this list. Now, if we try to use an index that isn't there, then we're going to get this index error exception. Now, oftentimes, we are going to need to concatenate two lists. Remember what concatenate means? It means joining two items together. So with that, we can use the plus sign, and we can concatenate two lists. We cannot concatenate a list with other data types, such as a number. We can also use our little handy shortcuts and use the plus equals to augment and assign the operator back to the original variable. We can also pull pieces of the list out. We don't need the entire list. We can pull sections out. And this is known as slicing. So a slice is a span of items that are taken from a sequence. Well, Professor Waits, why would we ever want to slice out our list? Well, we kind of do it all the time if you think about it. If you have a string and you want to pull pieces out of that string, think of the list of characters and how we're pulling those characters out of the string. It's the same way, but now we're talking about a list. We have a list of data, and we want just very specific portion of that list. We would use slicing to do that. So we always have this list, then we indicate it with start and stop with the brackets. And then we specify a start position and an end position. Now, if we don't specify a start, then it's going to start at 0. It's going to just say, you know what, they must mean 0. If we don't specify an end, then it's going to use the length of the list as the end index. One important piece to know is that the span does not contain the actual last item we specified. It brings it all the way up, but not including the end. Slicing expressions can include a step value and negative indexes relative to the end of the list. So you can do this also backwards, starting from the negative all the way to some other start point by using negative numbers. In the next video, we'll continue this conversation and we'll dive a little bit more into items within the list using the AND operator.